want to talk to you today about foundationalism. It's one of the most basic approaches to the problems of the theory of knowledge, to epistemology. It's one of the essential family of strategies that people use for understanding knowledge, where it comes from, what its limits are, what, if anything, justifies it. And so we're going to look at really the structure of a certain dilemma that Plato puts out near the end of the Theaetetus. The reason for looking at Plato's account is to understand the problem that an approach that seems very natural to knowledge faces. And we're going to see that later as an argument in favor of skepticism. But for now, I want to follow the argument out in a different direction to see where it leads us if we accept a foundationalist strategy. Let's start with the question, what is foundationalism? What does it mean to say that knowledge rests on a foundation? The basic idea is that knowledge is justified in terms of, or rests on. People are going to have different conceptions of what this resting on really is. But in the end, it rests on a foundation of basic knowledge. Basic knowledge meaning knowledge that is obtained directly, not by inference from something else we know. Some things, the thought is, are the result of argument. We infer it from something else that we perceive, something else that we know, but other things are known directly. We don't have to infer it from anything else. It's something we can know immediately without having to derive it from something else. The foundationalist says knowledge rests on such a foundation. There are things that are known directly, immediately, in that way. All sorts of people have held this sort of view. Aristotle, for example, tells us in the Posterior Analytics, in saying that the premises of demonstrated knowledge must be primary, I mean that they must be the appropriate basic truths. For identify primary premise and basic truth. A basic truth in a demonstration is an immediate proposition. An immediate proposition is one that has no other proposition prior to it. I call it an axiom because there are such truths, and we give them the name of axioms par excellence. Think about geometry, for example. You prove all sorts of theorems on the basis of definitions and axioms, postulates, things that are simply starting points in geometry. Things like between any 2 points that are distinct lies another point. Or 2 points determine a line. Things like that. Those are basic principles of geometry. They're not proved from other things. They are starting points. And the idea here of the foundationalist is that there always have to be starting points. There are things that you take as basic assumptions. Things that you think are fundamental things that you can know immediately. Many other philosophers have held this sort of view as well. Thomas Aquinas, for example, says that the precepts of the natural law are many in themselves, but are based on one common foundation. Notice that term, foundation. That's always a clue that this person is a foundationalist. They think of knowledge as resting on a foundation of basic truths known directly. Here is Descartes. It's now some years since I detected how many were the false beliefs I had from my earliest youth admitted as true, and how doubtful was everything I had since constructed on this basis. And from that time I was convinced that I must once for all seriously undertake to rid myself of all the opinions which I had formerly accepted, and commence to build anew from the foundation if I wanted to establish any firm and permanent structure in the sciences. So again, Descartes, like Aquinas, talks about a foundation and building firm knowledge on the basis of this foundation, a foundation that's solid because these are things known directly. Leibniz has a similar view. This raises another question, he says, whether knowledge of all truths depends on experience, on induction for particular cases, or if there are some which have another foundation. He thinks there are some that have another foundation, but the important thing for our purposes is that they have some foundation or other. There are things we know at the foundation level, directly, immediately. Kant says something similar in ethics. The foundation of this principle is that rational nature exists as an end in itself. John Stuart Mill, the creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. But notice he talks about this being the foundation of morals, the starting point, the thing that isn't proved, the thing that instead is a basic axiom from which everything else is proved. The foundationalist, then, thinks that knowledge stems from a foundation. Well, what's the argument for foundationalism? It's actually exactly the kind of argument you find in infinite regress arguments in general. In the infinite regress video, I sketched out this little diagram of an argument that says we start with a domain, we start with a relation on that domain, and we assume a few things. For example, non-emptiness, that there are things in that domain. And then we talk about seriality. That is to say, we assume that each thing in that domain has something that precedes it in that relation. Then we assume that that can't go back to infinity. There is no such thing as an infinite descending chain of these relations. And so conclusion, there has to be at least one thing that is a first R, a first element of these chains outside that domain. Well, what can we say here about that domain? The foundationalist says, let me take a typical case of knowledge, let's say a typical thing I might know about geometry, that the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees, for example, or the Pythagorean theorem, and think, yeah, I know that on the basis of other things. There's an argument for that. Maybe I just remember it as it happens, but in geometry, it's not like, oh, I once heard that from somebody. It's a question of deriving it from basic axioms. And so what we can do is say, well, let's take as our domain items of knowledge, and now we can think, what's the relation? Things like that, the Pythagorean theorem, the fact that the angles of a triangle total 180, those are things we know on the basis of other things. They're justified in terms of an argument, in terms of a proof. So let's take our relation as justification. Now we can say non-emptiness. There are D's. In other words, there are things we know. So the skeptic is wrong. We know some things. Now, seriality. Well, anything that is known must rest on something for its justification, right? So this premise, in this context, really just means knowledge implies that there's some kind of justification. Now, finiteness. The idea here is that it can't be something that rests on an infinite chain of premises. If we've got an argument for something, let's say a proof in geometry, it must be the kind of proof that actually can be stated in finite terms. It doesn't go on forever. Somebody says, well, wait, the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees in Euclidean geometry? Why? You say, well, let me tell you a long, in fact, infinitely long story about how I justify this. Somebody would say, not only do I not want to hear that, I don't understand how you could have ever heard the story. After all, if you had started listening to it, it would never have finished, you'd still be listening to it. So it can't be infinite and serve as any kind of justification. So we could say, yeah, look, justifications don't go on forever. Justification is finite. It must come to an end somewhere. But then look what the conclusion is. There is some first R. That is to say, there is some ultimate justifier that is outside that realm of knowledge. So we get basic knowledge. And this is the difficulty that Plato notices at the end of the Theaetetus, because he thinks that at that point it's a pretty plausible definition to say that knowledge is justified true belief. It's true belief with an account, as he says. But now he says, wait a minute, we've got a problem here. That seems very plausible. It's not just perception. That is to say, it's not just belief. It's not even just true belief, because things, we can be right accidentally. That doesn't make it knowledge. Instead, it's got to be something like true belief with an account. But on the other hand, wait a minute. We trace it back. If we have knowledge, if knowledge rests on a justification or account of some kind, and that always has to stop somewhere, it can't go on infinitely, then there must be things that are ultimate justifiers, but they're outside the realm of knowledge. But how can knowledge rest on things that are not known? If we've got knowledge resting on things that we don't know, it seems like that's not knowledge at all. So Plato gives up in puzzlement. think of this as cases of inferred knowledge. Then we get something that must be outside the realm of knowledge we infer from other things. We get basic knowledge. But of course, that's changing the rules of the game, really, changing the domain. And so, let's think of it another way. I said that finiteness premise, the justification doesn't go on infinitely, really amounts to three claims. One is that we don't have an argument from other premises that goes on infinitely. But it also meant nothing justifies itself, and there are no loops of justification. The foundationalist says, well, wait a minute, what about this one? If we're thinking of knowledge itself, and not just inferred knowledge, leading us back to basic knowledge, but we're thinking about this idea, we might say, what if we thought that actually there are things that justify themselves? Oh, maybe basic knowledge is like that, okay? That is to say, it's self-justifying. There's a term for that in philosophy. It's self-evident. We'll talk about the meaning of self-evidence more later. But that is one way of looking at the foundation. We might think of the foundation as something that involves going back to things that are basic knowledge in the sense that they are self-justifying. Now, there's another strategy. We could be a foundationalist in a somewhat different sense and say, actually, I don't want to do that. I'm worried about this idea of things being self-evident in the sense of justifying themselves. We'll really have to look at cases like Descartes' idea that the I think or the I am are fully self-justifying. But let's, for the moment, think about this in a different way. Think about this as knowledge, and let's just accept the conclusion. Knowledge does rest on something outside of knowledge. But unlike Plato, we don't have to panic and think, oh no, then the known rests on the unknown. That means it can't be known at all. It's just an assumption. And by the way, it can feel that way, right? You have something derived from the axioms, but why should you believe the axioms? Why should you believe the basic premises? If you don't, the whole thing falls apart and you know nothing. But this other strategy says, wait a minute, what if what we have as our justification ultimately is true, not something known exactly, but something perceived? So, for example, I am holding up a marker, a green marker. You might look at this and say, well, justify for me the claim that that is green. How would you do it by argument? You would say, look at it. For that matter, how would you justify the claim that the sky is blue? You might think, it's pretty basic. I don't know how to give you an argument from axioms for it. I just see it. Look up at the sky. It's blue. Look at the marker. It's green. We might think, in an alternate approach here, that actually what we get is something basic. A basic justifier. But it might be something that is itself outside the realm of knowledge. Not only because it doesn't have a justification, but because it's not even a belief. It's a perception. I justify my belief that this is green by looking at it, by my perceptual experience that it's green. And so I might think, maybe these are items of basic knowledge, maybe they are basic justifiers, i.e. perceptions. If that's true, then we've got that knowledge does rest on a foundation outside of itself. It is something that is a basic justifier. It's not itself justified. It's instead something we simply perceive. We see green. We look up at the sky and we see that it's blue. You listen to someone's voice and you simply perceive that they're talking. The foundation is a matter of perception. On this conception, it's perhaps perception together with some self-evident truths. So in either account, we could say this is what forms the basic foundation of knowledge. Those things that are known directly. Those things that are the ultimate justifiers. And then everything else rests on that. Like a building resting on a foundation, or like a layer cake resting on the bottom layer. Everything rests on that basic knowledge, basic, immediate, direct knowledge, or on things that are basically directly perceived.